Hi, my name is Wilhelmina York, and call me Mina. I decided to use Casa de Esperanza as my company for the workplace process improvement plan. A little intro to my overall goals were to implement a stronger volunteer program, increase community outreach and awareness, to facilitate client and employee relations, because I found that to be very important, as well as facilitating better communication between departments. A little about the company background. So, Casa de Esperanza is a nonprofit. It is a domestic abuse shelter. So, throughout the process, everybody that is being referred to as a client is an individual that is in shelter or in counseling, anybody that is accepting services from this nonprofit, which is why, due to the nature of this nonprofit, the location was never disclosed, privacy reasons. I also did not include any of the names of any of the employees for the same purpose. But I did include a little flow chart, and this flow chart, as you can see, is the executive director who created 2 new departments: the counseling department that only has 2 people working in it, and then a community outreach department to alleviate that stress off of the frontline staff. And then there's the program director, and then the frontline staff that she oversees. So the people that I talked to were the executive director. That was my first initial outreach, and then I also was more in touch with the program director and then a couple of the frontline staff. So historically, for this company, well, nonprofit, all of the umbrellas, there wasn't an umbrella. It was just one stick. So there was literally just an executive director, and then all of the frontline staff they did everything. So the counseling was underneath the frontline staff, the outreach and awareness underneath the frontline staff. And what the frontline staff does is they answer crisis calls, they answer the door to anybody that is seeking resources, they answer to any of the clients in shelter, they do literally everything. They also used to do counseling and provide counseling sessions for clients. They did all the community outreach and awareness, which is why they used to have a volunteer program, but because they then became understaffed, they were not able to keep up with this volunteer program. So, about a year ago, they got a new executive director, came in, saw all of the stress that the frontline staff and all of the responsibilities that they had, and decided, well, let's create 2 new departments to alleviate that stress. But with this creation did come some issues. It did alleviate stress, but also new problems came up, and I get into all of it. But just to give you a little bit of background about the company, what they do, and just the responsibilities of everybody. So my research process, first outreach, I had to make sure that it was okay. I first did outreach to the executive director, and I let her know what I needed from her, why I was doing this, what she would get out of it, and it is my own workplace. So just wanted to disclose that because it was more personal. That way I had more at stake, and it's actually stuff that I can honestly apply, and it was just more entertaining. And so after the outreach, did a little Gemba walk. I walked through what the frontline staff does. I walked through it as a client. I walked through it as a new frontline staff. I interviewed the old frontline staff. But I didn't interview them yet. This was just the Gemba walk, just to walk through the whole process and just see the whole layout of the shelter, and which was a little bit more difficult because this was more, all of the examples that we got in class were more supply chains, and so it was like physical products, where it's a little more difficult to analyze when it's services being provided, but it's still able to be analyzed as if they were products. So after my Gemba walk, I conducted interviews. And so, as I said, I did interview the program director and then two of the frontline staff. So I did interview a newer frontline staff and then an older, more seasoned staff member that had been there for 2 years. 2 years now. Yes. So after the interviews, I was able to identify more problems. So from the Gemba walk is where I figured out my research questions, interviewed individuals, identified problems, and then provided solutions. So the solutions were what we saw on the first slide of a volunteer program. Facilitating. How are we going to facilitate better communication between departments, and then what sort of positive outcomes come from facilitating conversations between clients and employees, because I felt that really kind of dropped off after the counseling department was created. So these are my research questions. What value does a volunteer program provide? What steps can be added, removed, reordered, or rescheduled to bring more value? How can the DMAC process provide structure? How can the 5 Whys identify opportunities? And then how can the 5 S's be applied in the volunteer program to improve knowledge? So these are my research questions that I pretty much figured out after doing my Gemba walk, and then they really did help shape when I was identifying problems and then providing solutions. So it was a lot, really helpful. But these are the methodologies I really focused on. Was Six Sigma, because I realized that the whole process was kind of flawed, and that a whole new process, such as like the volunteer program, needed to be created. And so why it's beneficial and why it's a good thing this volunteer program was being created, but I get into that later. So going back to the 5 Whys, as I was interviewing people, they were saying at first, I'm feeling overwhelmed, and this was like the newer kind of like older, not so much the program director, but just the 2 frontline staff members. They were feeling overwhelmed. Okay, why? There's too much to do. Well, why is that? Because there's a lot of new information and too many people needing things from them. And I'm like, okay, well, why is that? And then it's because they're the only person in shelter sometimes, which I think is insane. One person overseeing, 30 clients at a time, that's just in shelter. And that doesn't even include the crisis calls they get. That doesn't include anybody that comes up to the door, or just anything. And then some newer individual was they hadn't been completely walked through the whole process, and so they're feeling kind of just thrown into this whole thing. And so, to backtrack a little bit, they only get 40 hours of sexual assault training and then 40 hours of domestic violence training. So the whole 80 hours the first 2 weeks of their job is nothing to do with the whole process of the shelter itself. It is just training you on these subjects and the type of individuals that you are going to be seeing and helping. But going back to this, they hadn't been completely walked through the specifics of the job. And then why is that? And it's because they're understaffed. And they're tired and they're burnt out. And since they're understaffed, they're not able to have somebody really sit with them and hold their hand for the first whole week, because they don't have the bodies to do that. And then I did run through DMAC because I thought it was important to just kind of process everything. So my findings were that 1, it's a stressful work environment because it's disorganized. 2, it's understaffed. And then 3, lacking in communication, which also feeds into the stressful work environment. So my recommendations were, for being understaffed, volunteer program would be great. So just reinforcing the executive director's she already started kind of implementing it, and then I just kind of reiterated why it would be good and what sort of benefits she would get from it. So this also helps her write grants. But a volunteer program would be a great way to take care of the short staff problem. So 1, it is no cost. You only pay your outreach director and your volunteer program manager, but to get volunteers in shelter to alleviate the stress off of the frontline staff, so that they, 1, don't have to be in more than one place at a time, because a lot of the time they need to be physically like split in 3 different areas, and you literally can't do that. So volunteer program would be beneficial, so that they would then be able to say their volunteer is spending time with clients, because that was another issue when the counseling department was created. Was the frontline staff was thinking that since this department was created, they didn't have to do any of the counseling anymore. But then that feeds into the disorganization. So the counseling department is feeling a lot more stressed because the frontline staff isn't doing any counseling anymore. And that's where I was like, you guys need to update your job description. Actually sit down with the frontline staff and be like, hey, just because we changed this title, just because we created this whole new department, doesn't mean that you don't counsel anymore, because now this is what's happening with the counseling department. They're feeling a lot more stressed because they only see these people once a week, whereas the frontline staff sees them every single day. And they do like 8-10-hour shifts a day, the frontline staff. So they definitely see the clients more than the counselors do. But volunteer program would alleviate that stress for everybody. And then with the volunteer program comes the community outreach and facilitating awareness in the community, and it would just bring the shelter more publicity, which gets more funding, but still an undisclosed location. So with the disorganization, a script would be very good for newer employees and older employees, because having a script, having to, you answer the phone, you see somebody, somebody comes to the front door, they run through a whole script. That way, they're dotting every single I, crossing every single T, and so the counseling department can then be brought in to be like, hey, you also need to be doing this with these people because you're missing this. Like, this is crucial for me. Which is also where the lack in communication comes from. So if people go on leave, to take care of their mental health, or they have something going on, weekly updates for everybody to reference would be very important, as well as monthly meetings, because everybody needs to be on the same page, and that's where you can definitely share like new advancements. Like the counselors can be like, hey, I broke through with this person, can you please watch them on this, ask them how they're doing with this. But also confidentiality, super important. But yeah,